Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I wanted to talk to you today about breaking rules in dating, because when I reflect about my dating life, I would say that I'm quite an experienced dater and I've had quite a lot of long-term relationships as well. And obviously I've worked as a matchmaker and a dating coach for a few years now, and I've started to question all of the rules of dating, and I feel sometimes that we can get really bogged down in, oh, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. And when I was in my early 20s, I used to read a lot about relationships because I thought oh, I'm not very good at this, everything's going wrong, what am I doing wrong, how do I get a guy to behave in the way that I want him to behave, and it all becomes quite manipulative. So I used to read a lot, and I'd take bits of what I'd read, but certainly take everything with a pinch of salt, because ultimately most of the rules of dating are applicable a lot of the time, but not all of the time. It's so dependent on the dynamic between the two people. So I've learned that you can make loads of dating mistakes and get into a relationship, and you can also do everything by the book, really flawlessly perfect, and not. So it's important that you know what works for you as an individual, what sits right with you, and also how to adapt to another person, because every person that you date is going to be different. And if you start to get really heavily bogged down in the theories around relationships and dating, you can actually snooker yourself a little bit, because sometimes people pick up on the fact that you're not being authentic to yourself. So today I'm going to talk about the rules of dating and when to break those rules. So rule number one is don't date somebody if they say that they're not ready for a relationship. Now this one, I feel like it's a strong rule, it makes sense. It is a complete waste of time dating somebody who doesn't want to get into a relationship, right? Unless you don't want a relationship either. So if you don't want a relationship and you're genuinely just interested to get to know somebody, and you feel you're somebody who doesn't get overly attached to people, if you're that type of person and you believe that you're on the exact same page, then that is a rule that can be broken. However, I would tread very carefully if you're somebody who actually wants to get into a relationship, and if you're somebody that gets emotionally attached super easily. I have broken this rule on multiple occasions with varying different results. At times it has resulted in me being pretty heartbroken, and at other times it has worked. Now the one time it really did work, but it was non-intentional, is for the relationship that I'm in now. When I started to date my partner, he didn't want a relationship, and I didn't want a relationship either. I was just super attracted to him, and I know it's a bit crude, but I just wanted to sleep with him. I'm just gonna put it out there. I was I fancy him, I really wanna have sex with him, and maybe I shouldn't be saying this on YouTube, but whatever, that is the agenda that I had. And I think that his agenda was pretty similar. However, 5 years on, actually I think it's nearly 6 years, we're in a relationship, we've got 2 cats together, we live together, we are in a full-blown relationship. So luckily for us, it panned out because we were on the same page and we moved at the same rate. It's less likely to work if you're thinking, I'm gonna manipulate this person to get them into a relationship. If it happens organically, then fine. But this rule is a strong rule, and if you're someone who consistently does this, where they try and lure someone into a relationship and it doesn't actually work, this is something that you should definitely abide by, because 100%, there's nothing worse than getting emotionally attached to somebody who isn't actually interested. And if somebody says that they don't want a relationship, they do usually mean that, and you should listen to that, because I've seen so many times people come along and they say, oh, he doesn't want a relationship, he doesn't want a relationship, but he acts like he does, he's acting differently. It's listen to the words. Most of the time, the words in this spot actually mean more than the actions. It's probably the one place where you should listen to the words more than the actions. Someone who says they don't want a relationship is giving you a little warning, and you should at the very least take that warning seriously. Now what you do with that is up to you, but don't think that luring someone into a relationship is going to work, because most of the time it absolutely won't. The second rule is don't ghost. Now we all know that ghosting is a bad thing, right? Sometimes people do it because they want to avoid conflict and confrontation and all of that. But generally speaking, it is better to tell the person that you're dating that you don't want to date them anymore rather than just run away. Now, there is one caveat to this that I've come up with, and that is if somebody just isn't taking that information, like you've tried already to get rid of somebody and it's started to get a little bit stalkery, and in that spot, I would suggest cutting all contact and completely ghosting, because they're not taking on board what you're actually saying to them. And every time you respond, there's a chance that they can interpret that as hope. So it is better in that situation to move away. The third rule, don't text people, how are you? Now this is an interesting one because we ask people how they are all the time, right? And I've heard other dating coaches say things like, oh, if you ask someone how they are, it can open up a tin of worms, which kind of makes sense, but we're all used to like lying about how we are, right? So that's probably not so uncomfortable for somebody. It's not such a deep, delving, dark question. It's like probing them that heavily. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But of course, if you're every day texting someone like, how are you, how are you, how are you? It's just a little bit boring, isn't it? However, I don't think it's something that you must never do. I ask people at the start of all my coaching calls, like, how are you doing today? Pretty much, like, it's normal and people expect that kind of question to be asked. It's more important that your follow-up question, especially if you're texting, isn't boring as well. So you might ask a really generic question like, how are you? But once you get your response, ask something deeper and more meaningful or more fun. So, oh, I'm having a good day today, I'm having a great week, or I'm fine, thank you, how are you? I'm fine. So what makes you fine? What's the best thing that's happened to you today? What's the best thing that's happened to you this week? What's the most fun thing you've done since we last spoke? So you can make it a little bit more interesting after the initial boring question, because ultimately, sometimes if you just go in there with like a really jazzy question, it's a bit jarring. If someone just messaged me like, hey Abby, what's the top 5 things that you've done this week? I'd think like, oh, that's a bit strange. Whereas if someone said, hey Abby, we've not spoken to a while, wondered how you're doing, that's much more normal and it's okay. It's just like if your whole conversation is really, really boring from that point onwards. But I just wouldn't worry so much about asking the occasional like generic boring question, because that is pretty normal. And you don't want to stand out so much for being like this really over the top, eccentric character that's asking like mad questions all the time. Don't double text. Of course, we do not want to be a person who is always initiating contact, because it's quite low value and it looks a bit needy. Like if someone just keeps generating the conversation, keeps sending things out and they're not really getting much back, like we need to be aware of that. But if you have messaged someone something and they haven't responded, and then you realize like you didn't really ask them a question, it's okay to then like get in touch with them a couple of days later and ask a question. Like, as long as you're not constantly doing it, if you do it one time, that is like, I just don't see it as such a huge like crime. Because also like sometimes you'll receive a text from someone and it's just not like generating conversation, and you look and you're like, I don't know what to say back to that. So it could be that someone's seen it, realized that there's no real need to respond, and then hasn't responded. Also with the double texting thing, I feel like people often play games with each other. So if you occasionally double message, it throws the vibe of, I'm not actually playing a game. It's not like, it's different, it's how you do it. Like if you were to message somebody something and it's a question, they ignore it, I perhaps wouldn't message again. And I certainly wouldn't message like 2 days later with question mark, or why aren't you answering me? You know, like something really negative. The next one is one of my favorites because it does kind of drive me crazy. And that is that if you're a woman, don't approach a man. And if you're a man, don't date a woman who's approached you because she's definitely desperate. I'm just gonna put it out there that I approach my last 2 boyfriends and find that I get into better relationships from being the one that approaches, because sometimes the people that approach a woman are not the people that she wants to date. So if she just sits around doing absolutely nothing, chances are you're just going to get, you know, what you're given. And I don't believe that women should just be like, well, I'll just take whatever comes my way and I'll just sit here passively waiting for a guy to show up. I also don't buy into the fact that if a guy's interested enough, he's definitely going to approach. You as a woman have to, at the very least, I always say this, dangle that carrot, because some men won't approach because they're thinking, I'm not sure she's interested in me. Does that make them a bad life partner? No. It might not make them world's greatest player. In fact, the guys that are really, really keen to approach, sometimes, not always, but sometimes they might be a little bit of a player if they're like really smooth. Like, you have to be careful about what this person's showing up as, and how, you know, like the guys that are shyer, I think are worth approaching. And that is what I did with my last 2 boyfriends, and it worked an absolute treat. So I would never say to somebody like, oh no, 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 you must never approach a man, because he'll think you're desperate. You're either desperate or you're not. And if you know you're not desperate, you can approach a man and they can say no to you, and then you can just move on and be okay with it. So it's not about being desperate. So I think we should drop that narrative, even though it's wonderful, the idea of like some knight in shining armor just like trotting over on his horse. Sometimes that's not just going to happen, right? Sometimes you have to at least go to the stable. I feel like that's a really bad metaphor, but I'm sure you get it. So it's more about how you do it. So I wouldn't necessarily like bound over to somebody in a nightclub and start like pulling all these like moves and seducing him. But for sure, I would let my friends know who I was interested in so that they could drop that seed to him. Or I might approach on social media in a very light-hearted way. There are so many ways to do it now that we don't really need to just sit and absolutely do nothing, because if you're a little bit like me and a bit of an ice queen, you're not that approachable anyway, and the good guys might just be sitting on the sidelines thinking like, do I, don't I don't know what to do, I don't want to harass her. It can just get really confusing. So consider approaching men. Next one, don't have sex on the first date. Great rule, love it. I think if you want to have sex on a first date, if it's protected, if you know your intentions for having sex on a first date, if it doesn't make you feel bad to do it, I don't think it's bad to have sex on a first date. I think each to their own, and it's not the place of other people to judge other people's choices around sex. I really genuinely think that. However, on the flip side, if you're somebody that gets emotionally attached really quickly, if you don't really know this person, you don't think their intentions are good, you're only having sex because you think that's going to keep him there or keep her there, and you're like, it's not just for the enjoyment of it. If you're not clear on your intentions, it is a bad idea. Like 9 times out of 10, I'd say it's a bad idea to have sex on a first date, but you know, maybe 10% of the time it isn't, or whatever. And in that situation, it's like, well, it's fine. So if you've done it in the past and you feel bad about it, I just think forgive yourself for this treacherous sin that you have committed, and move forward from that. Like, if it doesn't work for you, don't do it. My final one for today, I'm sure there are loads more. In fact, if you have others, drop them in the comments box, like rules that you have around dating, and maybe if you can think of it, when you might break that rule. But the last one is, go on second dates to allow the spark to develop. Great rule, I say this a lot to people. Attraction builds over time. It's called the mere exposure effect, and it is proven that the more you see someone, the more likely it is that you're going to start to find them attractive. And also, if someone's got a great personality, you will begin to be more attracted to them naturally. However, sometimes you meet someone and they're rude, maybe they've got bad personal hygiene, maybe you've got nothing at all in common, you're on completely different pages about everything, and you're generally a little bit repulsed. Of course, in that situation, do not go on a second date. You're wasting their time and you're wasting your own. However, a lot of the time, we are fearful of going on a second date because we're worried that that person's going to feel like we've led them on, or something like that, if like it doesn't go beyond that point. So we make a really snap decision based on a first impression, and we don't give it any kind of room for that attraction to develop. In that spot, I would say don't worry so much about the expectations of the other person. You're not leading somebody on if you haven't made a decision yet, and you're better off going on a second date with somebody and then discovering that it's a no, than saying no on a first date and missing out on somebody awesome because you're fearful of the future. People sometimes go on first dates and they say to me, Abby, I couldn't imagine myself being in a relationship with her for the rest of my life. And I'm like, great, because you shouldn't have made that decision on a first date. A first date really is about finding out if you're curious about this other person and whether you enjoy spending an hour of your week with that person. That is all it should be. And then from there you build on it. So don't leap into the future, because when we leap into the future, it's terrifying, because you'll be thinking about walking down the aisle, is this the right person? And we can become completely bogged down by the future, and the future it's not happened yet, has it? So we don't need to worry about it. So those are my rules for dating and when to break those rules. If you have any questions for me, you can email me at abby@abbyblears.com, and you can also follow me on social media at Abby Blears. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.